On the morning of March 20th, 2020, in Pudong District, Shanghai, what seemed like a peaceful day in the bustling metropolis was suddenly shattered by a massive column of black smoke. Surveillance cameras along the street captured chaotic scenes. On one side, a panicked crowd pointing and shouting. On the other, flames and smoke engulfing an entire residential building. In the video, amid screams and fire alarms, a man could be seen crying and struggling, trying to break free from those holding him back so he could rush into the inferno. The flames rose high, consuming everything and burning through the desperate father's heart. His daughter was inside that burning house. An ordinary morning had turned into hell on earth. Someone asked, "Why would there be a fire so early in the morning? Did someone forget to turn off the gas stove?" Fortunately, firefighters arrived promptly, fighting desperately against the raging blaze minute by minute. Over an hour later, the fire was extinguished, but what they found inside left everyone speechless. Inside the charred house, a burned female body lay motionless among wooden debris and ashes. When the identity was confirmed, police painfully informed the collapsed father outside. It was his daughter, teacher Liu Min, 26 years old, a Chinese language teacher at an elementary school in Shanghai. The young woman should have been at school by now, like any other day. But why had she died in a fire in broad daylight? A fire that large would certainly take time to spread. Why hadn't she escaped? Before the father could begin to process his grief, the crime scene examination results struck like lightning from a clear sky. Liu Min did not die from the fire. On her body, burned beyond recognition, investigators found a fruit knife. This discovery immediately changed the entire nature of the case. The morning fire was no longer an accident, but a carefully orchestrated crime. Before the flames erupted, Liu Min had been murdered. Thinking about how their daughter, a gentle teacher in the prime of her life, had to die in such pain and solitude, her parents nearly collapsed completely. They couldn't believe the reality, fainting and regaining consciousness repeatedly amid the still smoldering ruins. The mother, Mrs. Dai, stood frozen before the blackened house, choking back tears. Who could be so cruel? Who could bear to kill my daughter? And then burn down her entire house? The pain of losing a child was carved deep into their bones. Amid that tragic scene, no one could hold back their emotions, because while the flames had been extinguished, the pain had just begun. The mother's anguished question was also what troubled the Shanghai police. Who could have acted so brutally? Fortunately, by 2020, Shanghai, China's most prosperous city, had been equipped with a modern urban surveillance system covering most streets. Since the case occurred in broad daylight, after a brief review, police traced important footage from cameras around the residential area. Frame by frame, small clues gradually pieced together the complete picture of the crime. And then, the suspect's profile became clear. The result shocked everyone. The person who murdered the female teacher and set fire to destroy the evidence was none other than her husband, Yan Moji. According to the forensic examination, experts discovered that the fetus in Liu Min's womb had developed noticeably. This meant that when she was murdered, she was pregnant. A small life that never got to see the world, leaving it together with its mother. Liu Min had only been married to Muji for 3 months, and it was hard to believe that the suspect was the very husband she had trusted. This result left anyone who heard it stunned, unable to believe their ears. For a young married couple, this should have been the sweetest time, when love had just borne fruit, when dreams of a future family hadn't yet faded. So what had made this man become so cold and cruel that he could kill his own pregnant wife? To understand that, we must go back to the beginning, to the fateful meeting between Liu Min and Moji. The victim, Liu Min, was a gentle and modest young woman, introverted and understanding. Since childhood, she had been known as well-behaved, had never been in a relationship, and always focused on her studies. After graduating from Shanghai International Studies University, she was hired to teach at a prestigious elementary school in Pudong District, a dream job for many young teachers. Liu Min's life was incredibly quiet, teaching in the morning, going home in the afternoon, occasionally gathering with friends on weekends, but mostly just familiar colleagues in education. Her social circle was small but sincere and pure. At work, teacher Liu Min was always dedicated and responsible toward her students. On days when parents arrived late to pick up their children, she wouldn't hesitate to stay in her office with them until evening, only leaving once all the children were safely picked up. Some days she didn't leave until 7 p.m., but she never complained. This persistence, attentiveness, and passion helped Liu Min quickly become a grade-level team leader, a position to be proud of for a teacher in her early 20s. Her future was opening up brilliantly. Stable job, beloved students, respected colleagues, proud parents. Yet ironically, love, what she thought would be life's sweet reward, became the tragic end of her fate. Yan Muji stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall, born and raised in a wealthy Shanghai family. As the only son, he was spoiled to the extreme, getting almost anything he wanted. Yan's father was a successful businessman who, through years of business dealings, had accumulated considerable wealth. However, what he could give his son was limited to money. Care, sharing, and guidance were extremely scarce. From childhood, Yan was wrapped in silk and satin. His parents readily spent enormous amounts of money for him to attend the best private schools in Shanghai. 20 years ago, tuition at those schools reached 40,000 to 60,000 RMB, approximately 6,000 to 9,000 US dollars per semester, an amount only upper-class families could afford. But for Father Yan, this was no burden. In his eyes, no amount of money was too much to spend on his son. When he reached high school, Muji began showing weakness in academics. He failed to get into any domestic university, but this didn't concern his father. To him, money could solve any problem. Without hesitation, Father Yan spent an enormous sum to send his son to study in England, hoping a new environment could help Muji change his destiny. Throughout those years, his father continued providing generous support, tuition, rent, pocket money, not a penny short. He practically carried his son's entire life on his shoulders, believing that given enough resources, Muji would naturally succeed. But reality proved completely opposite. Muji's academic performance not only failed to improve, but got progressively worse. He often complained to his father about being pressured by teachers abroad, about life being too difficult, about not being able to take it anymore. Without obtaining a degree, Muji hastily returned home. But in outsiders' eyes, he still bore the label overseas graduate returning from England, a title that earned many people's admiration. No one knew that behind that glamorous facade was a young man living dependently, lacking direction, and never truly having grown up. Then, like a twist of fate, teacher Liu Min, gentle, hard-working, and modest, was introduced through a neighbor to Yan Muji, the wealthy young master who had studied abroad in England. They met in January 2019, and their relationship progressed quite quickly. In August of the same year, they registered their marriage. On January 1st, 2020, the wedding ceremony was officially held with blessings from both families. The first few months after marriage seemed to pass peacefully. No arguments, no conflicts, at least from the outside. Liu Min's father often proudly told neighbors that his daughter was the youngest grade-level team leader at a prestigious Shanghai elementary school, while his son-in-law had studied abroad and now had a stable job at an auto parts manufacturing plant. Mr. Liu always felt reassured and proud about this. Mr. Liu once tearfully shared with the media, "The main thing was that my daughter agreed, and we respected her opinion. After marriage, their relationship was very good. We hardly saw any conflicts. The incident happened on a Friday. Tuesday and Wednesday, my daughter and Muji stayed at his parents' house. Thursday, my daughter taught online classes at home, and in the evening, she stayed with us for dinner. Muji didn't come that day. That evening, the three of us watched TV together. Everything was normal. No one expected that just one day later, everything would be gone." The day before the incident, Liu Min had even happily told her mother about being pregnant. The joy of impending motherhood had just begun to bloom, not yet shared with her husband, when fate cruelly closed the door on everything. But in today's materialistic and deceptive society, people easily hide their true nature behind a perfect facade. The Liu family never imagined that their seemingly refined and educated son-in-law was actually an overseas graduate who returned empty-handed, unable even to obtain his degree. Beneath the polite exterior and appearance of a model husband, Muji concealed a habit that destroyed both character and life. He had fallen into gambling, something that causes people to lose their reason and eventually their conscience. During interrogation, when police unexpectedly mentioned his parents, Muji momentarily showed confusion. "He's not your biological father, is he?" "Why isn't he my biological father?" "Didn't they adopt you?" I don't know." "They never told you?" "No." At that moment, a painful truth was revealed. Muji was actually adopted. Even he only learned this after being arrested. His adoptive father, in an interview after the case, recounted that he and his wife once had a biological son, but the child unfortunately passed away from leukemia. The loss was so great that they decided to adopt a child from Anhui province. That child was Muji. For all those years, they never told him this truth. They treated him like their own flesh and blood, providing him with proper education, sending him to the best schools, even supporting him into adulthood. In their eyes, Muji was their only remaining child, the hope to fill the void in a family that had suffered loss. After the college entrance exam, Muji only got into a mediocre university with little reputation. After studying for a while, he became discouraged and dropped out halfway. Wanting to create new opportunities for his son, the adoptive father once again opened his wallet, deciding to send him to study in England, hoping an international environment would make him change. However, those years abroad didn't help Muji mature. He didn't focus on his studies, frequently skipped classes, spent money recklessly, and finally returned home in failure. No degree, no direction, not even willpower. Out of love for his son, the adoptive father continued to help, using connections to arrange a stable job for Muji at an auto parts manufacturing plant. But by this point, Muji's mind was no longer on work. Going to work each day was just a formality. He felt that a monthly salary of over 3,000 RMB, approximately 420 USD, was nothing compared to the pocket money his father gave him. To fully devote himself to gambling, Muji secretly quit his job at the auto parts plant without telling his parents. Each morning, he would still put on his work clothes and leave as usual, returning in the evening, making anyone watching believe his life was stable. He disguised himself so skillfully that even his adoptive parents, living under the same roof, had no idea. Everything only unraveled when one day, the adoptive father received a call from the Social Security office, informing him that Muji hadn't paid insurance for several consecutive months. Only then did the elderly father realize his son had quit his job long ago. He couldn't understand. All these days, the boy left in the morning and came back at night. So where was he going? What was he doing? Faced with his parents' relentless questioning, Muji finally had to confess everything. It turned out that after quitting, he had tried to find work, but with no degree, no experience, no connections, he couldn't accomplish anything. Feeling discouraged, Muji was lured by friends into online betting, and what started as just for fun turned into gambling to survive. In just 6 months, he was completely sucked into the gambling vortex, winning little, losing much, debts piling up. When he had no money left, Muji started borrowing from loan sharks. Principal, interest, then compound interest, everything quickly ballooned into an enormous sum exceeding 2 million RMB, approximately 280,000 US dollars. By the time his pockets were empty and friends had turned their backs, Muji could only turn to his parents for help. In desperation, Muji knelt before his father, crying while handwriting a pledge, promising to quit gambling from then on, to rebuild his life. But he had no idea that the adoptive father standing before him was silently battling terminal cancer. A father being threatened by death, yet still having to bear the pain from a fallen son. Many people hearing this story might blame Muji's adoptive parents for not letting go, not letting him face the consequences to learn how to grow up. But that's easier said than done. Parental love, whether for biological or adopted children, is an emotion that cannot be explained by reason. Even though this child had disappointed them, they still chose to forgive, still chose to save him, as if that were the only way to hold on to their last hope. Faced with his pleas, prostrations, and tear-stained promises, the parents softened. They paid off more than 2 million RMB, approximately 280,000 US dollars, in loan shark debts on his behalf. They believed that after being rescued from this abyss, Muji would change, would learn to cherish the chance to rebuild his life. Perhaps after the debt crisis, Muji also felt shame and fear about the consequences he'd caused. After his adoptive parents paid off that enormous sum, he seemed to change. Outwardly, he became more composed, started working again, and behaved more appropriately and courteously with those around him. He looked no different from a prodigal son who knew how to turn back. It was precisely at that time that fate brought him to meet elementary school teacher Liu Min, a gentle, innocent young woman introduced through an acquaintance. Love came quickly and seemed beautiful. They met in early 2019, then quickly married in 2020. Both families were satisfied. The groom's family gained a gentle, educated daughter-in-law. The bride's family gained a son-in-law who had studied abroad with stable employment. A picture of happiness seemed to be unfolding, with a warm home, stable work, and a future full of hope. However, if the story had ended there, perhaps this would have been a happy ending. About someone who once fell but knew how to stand up. About a girl who believed love could redeem people. But life isn't a fairy tale. Just 3 months after the wedding, all that beauty shattered. Muji once again lost control, and this time, he did the unforgivable, something that caused the person who loved him most to die in utter agony. So what turned this man into a monster? What kind of love could lead to such brutal crime? For Liu Min's parents, the pain of losing their daughter transformed not only into hatred for their cruel son-in-law, but also deep resentment toward the other family. They couldn't understand why such a serious matter as Muji's gambling addiction had been kept secret before the marriage. Because if they had known the truth, would any parent have agreed to marry their daughter to such a degenerate person? In their eyes, it wasn't just one individual's crime, but the deception of an entire family. Liu Min's parents felt deceived, betrayed, a betrayal that cost their daughter her very life. However, from the perspective of Muji's adoptive parents, they themselves were also shocked by this tragedy. The adoptive father, in an interview after the case, said that initially he had no intention of hiding his son's dark past. He had given Muji 2 clear paths. First, if he truly repented and was determined to rebuild his life, the father would help pay off all the loan shark debts and arrange the wedding so he could start fresh. Second, if Muji still hesitated, still wanted to continue his old ways, then he would tell the other family the whole truth, and the marriage would stop there. All of this was completely unknown to the victim's family before their daughter's wedding. They only learned it piece by piece after their daughter's death. Muji's parents not only paid off the loan shark debts, but also organized a grand wedding ceremony for him. After the case occurred, police questioned neighbors, who all said that Muji was usually cheerful, quite friendly to others, and showed no signs of violence. If viewed from outside, their marriage seemed to still be passing smoothly. But inside, the old demon in Muji's heart had awakened. Although he had knelt and promised his adoptive father to rebuild his life, Muji in reality still couldn't escape his gambling addiction ingrained in his blood. After just a few months of stability, he once again sank deep into the mire, and the result was debts continuing to pile up. This time, the amount exceeded 1 million RMB, approximately 140,000 US dollars. Creditors constantly called, threatened, even came to his door, throwing him into a state of extreme panic. On the morning of March 20th, 2020, around 8 a.m., Muji drove to his in-laws' house in Pudong district. At that time, Shanghai was in a lockdown period due to the pandemic, so Liu Min had temporarily moved back to her parents' house to conveniently teach online classes to students. Muji knew that the Liu parents were out early that day, leaving only his wife home alone. At that moment, his mind held only one thought: He must have money at any cost. He brought a tense expression, but tried to maintain a normal tone as he entered the house. In the second-floor bedroom, he laid out the situation to his wife, Liu Min. He told his wife he was in trouble and needed to borrow some money urgently. He hoped she, his gentle wife carrying their first child, would trust and help him. Only at this moment did Liu Min learn the horrible truth. The husband she had trusted and loved was actually just a gambling addict with no way out. She was frozen in shock upon hearing Muji confess that he owed over 1 million RMB, approximately 140,000 USD, and needed 250,000 RMB, approximately 35,000 US dollars immediately to resolve urgently. Liu Min firmly refused. In blind rage, he rushed down to the kitchen, grabbed a fruit knife, and returned to the bedroom. At first, he only intended to threaten her to force his wife to give him money. But when Liu Min once again affirmed that she would not give him money, Muji completely lost control, frantically stabbing the knife repeatedly into his young wife's neck until she died. But Muji still didn't stop there. In fear of being discovered, he sought to destroy the evidence. He used a lighter to set fire to books, curtains, then all the items in the bedroom, trying to create a false crime scene of a fire accident. The flames spread quickly, burning down the second floor of the house before he coldly fled the scene. A few hours later, under pressure from his conscience and police pursuit, Muji turned himself in. He confessed the entire crime, his voice hollow as if recounting someone else's story. In the recorded interview, when asked about his future, Muji only briefly replied that he didn't want to say anything more, just waiting to be executed. After surrendering, Muji displayed an attitude that stunned everyone involved in the investigation. He showed no remorse, no fear or pain. His face was almost expressionless, his eyes eerily empty. When asked about the crime he committed, Muji only answered curtly, his voice steady as if talking about someone else's business. He even said he hoped to be shot soon to get it over with, as if death were a relieving escape. This indifference surprised even the prosecutors. A lawyer later assessed that Muji showed no signs of repentance. What he wanted wasn't forgiveness, but simply to give up. It wasn't the remorse of someone aware of their mistakes, but the desperate emptiness of someone who had completely lost all sense of right and wrong, life and death. For him, everything had collapsed, nothing left to hold on to. This abnormal attitude forced police to conduct a psychiatric evaluation to rule out the possibility of mental disorder or loss of behavioral control. However, the evaluation results showed that Muji's mental state was completely normal. He was fully conscious when committing the crime, meaning all actions were intentional. So what made an educated man, newly married, about to become a father, capable of killing his pregnant wife over just 250,000 RMB, approximately 35,000 US dollars? That amount for many people is substantial, but for Muji it wasn't necessarily so. Because according to his own confession at their wedding, they had received up to 750,000 RMB, approximately 105,000 USD in bride price money. So the question arises, was this really just about money, or was it something deeper? The collapse of personality, absolute dependence on gambling, or simply the corruption that had been eating away at his soul for a very long time? On July 30th, 2021, the sensational Shanghai murder and arson case was officially brought to trial at Shanghai No. 1 Intermediate People's Court. After the review and confrontation process, the trial panel determined that defendant Yan Muji had intentionally taken another person's life, then committed arson to cover up the crime. This behavior not only constituted intentional murder, but also seriously threatened public safety. The verdict clearly stated that Muji acted with base motives, cruel methods, and particularly serious consequences, demonstrating a high degree of personal danger. His voluntary surrender after committing the crime could not be considered a mitigating circumstance, as it was merely an action after the crime had been completed. Based on the entire nature, degree of crime, and social harm caused, the court pronounced, for the crime of intentional murder, Muji was sentenced to death and deprived of political rights for life. For the crime of arson, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison and deprived of political rights for 1 year. Finally, the court decided to execute the death penalty and simultaneously deprive defendant Yan Mojie of political rights for life. From when the case occurred to the day of sentencing, a total of 497 days had passed, over a year and a half of waiting in pain and despair. Upon hearing that Mujie was finally sentenced to death, Liu Min's aunt wailed uncontrollably, then collapsed right in front of the courthouse. The resentment and grief suppressed for nearly 2 years suddenly poured out in choking sobs. The victim's mother stood silent for a long time, her hands trembling as she held the verdict. Her tears fell unceasingly. She softly spoke, her voice breaking with interrupted breaths. Finally, the murderer has paid the price. My daughter, Mother has something to tell you now. Outside the courthouse, there were not only Liu Min's family members, but also people who had known her, including Mrs. Zhang, a parent of a student Liu Min had once taught. When asked about the former teacher, Mrs. Zhang couldn't hold back her tears multiple times. She recounted, "Teacher Liu taught Chinese to first and second graders. Gentle, patient, always treating every child fairly, whether students were excellent or struggling. Once on a field trip, she led over 40 students alone, but still took care of each one thoroughly, buying tissues, buying snacks for each child. On the way back, she sat on the bus, with little students chirping around her, some wanting to braid her hair, others asking her to tell stories. That scene is still in my head as if it were yesterday." In Mrs. Zhang's eyes, Liu Min wasn't just a dedicated teacher, but like a big sister to her students, always gentle, caring, and full of love. That's why her death wasn't just one family's loss, but the pain of all those small hearts she had cherished. Beyond the horrifying details, this case also left some touching moments. According to Mujie's own confession, when he came demanding money, Liu Min firmly refused, not out of selfishness, but because she wanted to keep that money to treat her father-in-law who was suffering from cancer, a daughter-in-law who hadn't yet become a mother, still thinking of her father-in-law, still worrying about her husband's family more than herself. Yet ironically, the husband she wholeheartedly loved was the very person who took her life, right when she was carrying their child. One body, two lives. This tragedy makes anyone who hears it choke with emotion. And in that fire, there was an image that left all the firefighters silent. When the flames erupted, neighbors rushed up to help put out the fire and casually opened the cage to let Liu Min's 2 small dogs out. One of them, named Tang Tang, after running to safety, turned back and rushed into the sea of flames. When the fire was extinguished, Liu Min's body was found, and right beside her was Tang Tang, the small body burned and charred, still lying close to its owner, as if trying to protect her until the very last moment. Faced with that scene, people couldn't help but shudder and ask themselves, even a dog knew how to sacrifice for its owner, yet Mujie, the one who shared her bed, could kill the person he loved. The saying goes, you can know a person's face but not their heart. There are people who wear gentle faces and speak softly, but hidden deep inside is a dark abyss no one suspects. A personality seemingly built meticulously over the years ultimately collapsed over just 2 words: money. Beneath the shell of a model husband, Mujie was actually a demon in human form, cold, cruel, and selfish to the point of no return. Growing up wrapped in silk and satin under the blind indulgence of his parents, Yan Mujie grew up with a dependent, arrogant character who didn't know how to cherish anything. When he returned from England, he had no career, no direction, living an empty and lazy life. It was during that aimless period that the door to the abyss of gambling opened, and he stepped in without hesitation. Gambling, a spiritual poison that seems invisible but can destroy an entire life. At first just testing luck, then sinking deeper, and finally despair. Although his parents paid off over 2 million RMB, approximately 280,000 USD in debt, opening a path for him to start over, a person who has lost control can no longer be saved by anyone. From that point, tragedy began to quietly take shape. from online gambling sessions to lies within the family, ending in a brutal case that shocked society. Muji's story isn't just a verdict for a murderer, but also a warning to those burning their own lives in the flames of greed. Because when people have lost their humanity, no matter how many chances to start over, it's all in vain. And that's today's case. What are your thoughts on this case? Share in the comments below. Thank you for following, and see you in the next videos.